So I should actually say one thing before. I actually go by Christopher because my wife is named Chris, and it causes this wonderful ambiguity. So it's for whatever. Thank you for.
That's why I want to say my name is Jack and not John, because sometimes people turn my name into John.
Well, anyway, and you actually have to be kind of belligerent about that if you make a shift like that, and if you really don't have that much invested in it, it's a little bit weird. So anyway, so what I would say, thank you for the serious comments. I'll set aside the smaller ones in the sense that, yeah, I do think that there's the conventional narrative, not just about accountability, but energy and dispatch and all these other things. That is the conventional narrative that I think we're going on. So let's go right to it. So Madison, Madison was no Democrat, in my opinion. And so this is the question is I'm drawing a bunch of lines together. And in fact, the Senate may have been, was clearly supposed to protect the institution of property. And you start to actually, and part of the sections I dropped earlier for some of his earlier writings to try to develop this a little bit more that clearly need to go back in the paper, but it's when you look at why he wanted the Senate to look a certain way and why he was disappointed with how it came out, we can start to look at some of the clues and some of the things he said, and it's a question of interpretation about whether he wanted, what role he wanted the Senate to play. And I do think he wanted to be a deliberative body, but that's, like process theory is deliberative to what end? He cared about deliberation not in a value of itself, but because he thought it would achieve certain substantive outcomes that clearly would be more protective of property. And I think there is clear statements by Madison to that effect. And to the extent to which that's class-based or not class-based is a different question. But I do think that there's these clear statements early on about he was very afraid of democracy, direct democracy, and mob rule and these other things. And that, to me, the idea that the Senate was clearly supposed to stop that and to be a resistance to that. And whether that is, in fact, protecting class interests or is anti-democratic still begs the question to me about what's the problem with democracy and who's hurt by those interests. And that's sort of what I'm trying to do with that direction of this. The other thing that's interesting is the account of the presidential selection is absolutely something that's underappreciated in the literature. And in fact, we tend to look at these things without understanding how deeply involved the politics of almost every other decision often intertwined and played back and forth. To say that there was cycling among the different decisions, I think, is not quite complete enough. What struck me is how often proposals for direct election, how often that lost, and that in fact, it was still tending towards legislative selection pretty much the entire way through. And cycling, but they never got off the basic proposal because they never managed to tweak it around. And it really was the threat of non-re-eligibility for a re-election of Washington that caused the whole thing to shift. Because they realized that if they left it with the legislature and Washington was re-eligible for any president would be re-eligible for election, then they would be completely under the thumb of the legislature. And that was the concern that came out in the debates. And so what I see is that not so much that this is underestimated in terms of there's this cycling and that we don't have that all taken into account. I think it's not taken into account, but what I saw was a run away from democratic principles and towards direct election or even electoral college. And those votes were resoundingly, he lost by big margins, vote after vote after vote. And there was a presumption of this idea of legislative supremacy, and that got folded into the debate, and that as we matured through the debate, they started to get this more sophisticated notion that if we left it that way, we're going to end up with a result that we're not very happy with. My point about that is they actually took a much more institutionalist, comparative institutionalist, and structural idea than some of the simplistic visions of separation of powers that are often thrown in the debate would lead you to believe, and that if you actually read these, that it leads to a much more balancing idea that I think is much more interesting and a much richer account of what happened in 1787.
All right, so we'll open it for questions. Our first trio is Randy Barnett, Sam Rickless, and Tom Colby.
Thanks. I really enjoyed the paper. I highly encourage you. I encourage people to be interested in Wilson. I like to think of myself also as a Madisonian, but I've grown to really, really like Wilson. In many ways, one of which I'll elaborate on in a second. I have just basically, I think he's quite underrated. I think part of the reason why he became our most forgotten founder is because he died the way he died, and he was some embarrassment to his cohorts, and he just did not die with honor. in the way they valued so highly. And I think that's part of the unfortunate reason why he's so neglected. I have a small issue and just a slightly bigger one. The small issue is just how you frame the paper the way it currently is. In the beginning, you say it was Wilson's view that prevailed, not Madison's, which is your theme. I don't think the paper delivers on that claim at all. I think the paper, if you read it fairly, basically says nobody got what they wanted exactly. Everybody was thwarted. Wilson had his views. I tend to agree with Jack that Wilson and Madison worked really pretty closely together as kind of senior and junior partners in terms of their stature at that moment in history. But I just don't think it comes out. I don't think the paper shows that Wilson won. I think it shows that on some issues he won, and some issues he didn't, and Madison won on some, and then finally, at the end, you kind of shift your claim. A moment's reflection reveals that Wilson's vision is the one that became a reality. Well, that might be true. That means down the road, maybe the Hamiltonian vision came to be more accepted, even though that wasn't in the Constitution either necessarily. But so that could be right. It's not the same claim as you make at the beginning, though. And so I just think this is over-claiming. You don't need to do it. You don't deliver on it, so you might as well just not do it and just deliver on what it is you want to deliver on. So that's the smaller point. And this other one is not even a big objection. It's something that I'd like to know more about. Unfortunately, it's not really the point of this paper, but it's on page 32. One of the reasons why I'm so interested in Wilson has to do with what you say about him accurately, I think. For Madison, the government was designed to represent social interests, so I'm not necessarily accepting that. But where for Wilson, the government was designed to represent individuals. And then, I'm not going to say what you're right about Madison, but I think that is true about Wilson. And then, in addition, at the end of the paragraph, he viewed the fundamental units of politics to be the individual and not the states. Well, my interest in Wilson comes from his decision in Chisholm versus Georgia, where he really explains this in much greater detail, and part of the reason why an individual can sue a state, because the individual is the unit of sovereignty. And my current and future work builds a lot about that. So I'm very interested in that. It's not really part of the executive power, so it's not really part of this paper. But I do think that's in tension with the very next sentence and the next section, where you talk about, but Wilson's commitment to democracy, and it's all about Wilson the Democrat and everything else you say about Wilson the Democrat. I think this needs to be thought through a lot better and be more specific about what you mean by Democrat. Democrat has various meanings, especially then, and it is somewhat of a pejorative, like demagogue is today. Nowadays we think of it as somewhat a majoritarian approach, but I don't think Wilson was a majoritarian. It might mean he likes elections better than as a constraint or as an institutional matter than Madison does. It can mean a lot of things. I don't think being a Republican is the same thing as being a Democrat back then. And what was he? So I just think this is really uncareful. I don't really know what the truth of the matter is about. I'm open to the suggestion that it turns out he was more of a Democrat, like as they came to be thought of later. He was kind of a proto-Democrat. I'm open to this hypothesis. I just don't think this part of the paper delivers, and it's not specific enough, and it isn't supported enough. So I would either drop it for future work, or I would develop it a lot more. And it is in tension with this other very important thing I think about Wilson, is that he's really committed to a popular sovereignty based on individuals, not based on majorities, but on individuals.
So I was going to make the first point that Randy made, and let me just add to what Randy said. Reading this, I had the impression that I was reading about a series of Wilson losses. Amendment to eliminate the legislative override loses it unanimously. Adding the Supreme Court to the veto process, no good. Increasing the supermajority needed to override to 3/4, loss. Sole power to appoint judges in the executive, loss. Wilson suggests that the president be elected by 15 members of Congress chosen by lot, nutty. Agrees to postpone, it comes out of my mouth, and as I'm saying it, I'm thinking, no. And then he wins. at the end. So I guess I did get the sense that Randy was right, that, it's just exactly what you would expect with committees. Not everybody got everything that they wanted. There were some who they were pushing some ideas, others were pushing other ideas, and they all had to compromise, and what they came up with was something that had both elements of mixed government and elements of separation of powers strictly understood. And, probably nobody was completely happy, but it wasn't bad for committee work.
I guess my comment picks up on a lot of what Randy was saying in his second point, and that is, even if we take that Wilson was a Democrat in the way that you're saying, and I think Randy's right that might not be the whole story, but if we take that to be true, I don't think, I know more about Madison than I know about Wilson, and I have not typically viewed Madison as so much a mixed government person, as so obsessed with class and class interests and that sort of thing. I mean, I'm inclined to, the same story you tell, the evidence you give, to me, paints Madison more as a person who's concerned with individual rights, a person who's concerned with a constitutional system that will protect rights and liberty. Now, it may be true that the rights that he cared the most about were the property rights of the wealthy, but I think what you have here is consistent with that story. And so we may have a battle between, again, if you're right about Wilson, someone whose vision of the Constitution is primarily democratic and someone whose vision of the Constitution is primarily libertarian. And if that's what the fight is about, and again, I take no position on whether it is, but my thought would be Madison wins that fight more than he loses it. We don't have a particularly democratic Constitution, much to the chagrin of Sandy Levinson, but we do have a particularly libertarian constitution. Some would say a very libertarian constitution. And in that sense, maybe one version of this story is, not only is Wilson the loser in a series of little battles, Wilson, if he is the Democrat, is the big picture loser because we get much less democracy and much more liberty than maybe we could have gotten if things had played out differently.
So I apologize for the fact that the piece was put together quickly, as Jack has noted. And so I guess the claim I'm making is not that he won at the end of the convention. This theme I really want to bring out is that the modern government we have really resembles, to me, more Wilson's conception, and particularly with respect to the amendments that we get increasing democratic election, and in fact we have a strong executive. And in fact, I do think that that's very helpful to reframe that paper. Now, the question is he about the question that both Tom and Randy are talking about? So the defense of why he's distinct from Madison really goes back to a series of work that traces his thinking to the Scottish Enlightenment. He was born in Scotland, studied in Scotland, student of Adam Smith, David Hume, Thomas Reid, and became part of the common sense philosophy, which really believed that people had the ability to perfect themselves, that they had a tremendous faith in the individual in a way that really wasn't present in other forms of European philosophy at the time. And what strikes me, he seemed to fear elections and the results of elections less than Madison. And less than, to me, than any other, well, not any, it's not a contest, but then the vast majority of what used to be the debate to happen. And so if I were to expand, I would be inclined to expand the section, to look at the philosophical roots about why he felt this way, and why, maybe the thing I'm struggling now is it class, is it not? But clearly Madison was throwing up institutional barriers, regardless of what the animation was, to mediate between direct elections and the processes themselves, and clearly thought of that as a significant effort. And whether it's favoring a class, there's clearly a bigger suspicion on Madison's part of elections than what you see out of Madison, or frankly, most of the other framers, not to single out Madison. And so, my reaction is, the other thing is, I do understand it's not bad for committee work and its compromises, but there's a legacy of Madison, and going back to the notes on Virginia and all this, where there is a certain vision of government with particular institutions playing critical roles. And I do think maybe you win some, you lose some, but the version that we got at the end of the day doesn't really accord the Senate the role that the Virginians wanted. And that I'm willing to try to play around with and defend better, but I guess the point of that is not so much that Wilson won everything, but the vision that we had that this is the Madison Constitution, to me, just doesn't ring true. That in fact the Senate ends up being a much weaker institution. And in fact, they say in the days after the Great Compromise, Madison was visibly depressed during the convention and just couldn't, just was listless. And Wilson's still soldiering on, trying to do something with the organization. And in fact, to me, there's a distinct difference that in fact, there is something to the claim that whatever we say, this was not the structure of government that the Virginians were looking for when they walked into Philadelphia in 1787.
Okay. Mike Ramsey, Don Drips, and Mike McConnell.
Yeah, well, I think this is a really interesting paper. Thanks very much, and I like the focus on Wilson that's been coming out recently. And so I want to do two things quickly. One is to maybe push back a little bit on the idea that Wilson wasn't as important as you say. I think he actually, I'm inclined to agree that at least with respect to executive power, I think that you may even understate. Then I want to ask a methodological question that maybe would push a little bit on some conversations we had yesterday. So just on Wilson and executive power, it seems to me that, yeah, Wilson lost a lot, but the thing he really won on was the idea of the president being separate from the legislature, which was something that was not contemplated early on. At least not seriously contemplated by people who mattered. And Wilson was the one who really made that a reality. Of course, he didn't get everything he wanted because he wanted a direct election, but that was not going to happen given the way people thought about things at the time. So he really got about as much as he could realistically hope for, which was to get the president's the selection of the presidency split off from the legislature. And to a very significant extent, that is the foundation of our separation of powers. Because, and here I think Wilson's practical thinking comes out, is that it doesn't really matter how much you separate the offices if you don't separate the selection. And I think that's a Wilsonian, that strikes me as a Wilsonian insight. That's actually really important. And I guess maybe as a suggestion in the paper, I wonder if this doesn't get lost a little bit because you talk about other places where Wilson lost, as with the Senate and so forth, but I don't think it isn't part of the story about executive power. Anyway, so that's my first point. So this is a methodological question, I guess, not about the paper itself, but about its implications. And I'm not sure what you think about this, so this is sort of intended to be open-ended. So if we accept this account of Wilson as being instrumental in forming the office of the executive as we know it, but then you say that Wilson was this practical oriented guy who didn't buy into the theory so much and didn't read Montesquieu and so forth, so I guess the question is then, where does that leave us in terms of what we know about Wilson if we're going to think about the meaning of executive power, the original meaning of executive power? Do we put a lot of weight on the idea that Wilson was sort of one of the architects and Wilson, let us say, I'm not sure I agree with this, but I take your word for it, that Wilson didn't have much interest in Montesquieu's definitions or the theory of separation of powers as it came out of England and out of Montesquieu. Then does that affect the way we think about executive power? Does that tell us then that we shouldn't be spending so much time trying to figure out what Montesquieu and the English revolutionaries thought about executive power, and that we should be looking at it through a more, shall we say, functionalist lens? And I think you might be sort of implying that, and I'm not sure if you are. And if you are, I'd like to hear more about why, because I guess sort of I would have a rebuttal, which is Wilson, at the end of the day, was just one guy. And how much we can piggyback on his thinking to get the meaning of language that was, after all, adopted by the whole convention and then the ratifying conventions, I have some skepticism. So I guess on the one hand, well, I think, I think Wilson's really important. That's my first comment. But my second comment is, well, maybe not as important as when it comes to our interpretive methodology as perhaps the paper implies.
Yeah, this comes at the distinction between a hierarchical executive and what the executive power as a hierarchy wields are. And Wilson comes to mind because he's a lawyer, and so he's intimately familiar with the legal machinery.
Louder, John?
I'm sorry. This is about what the executive powers actually were, and the vast bulk of criminal law enforcement in the colonies, in the states, and in the early republic did not flow through the executive branch of the government. The government attorneys were interested in revenue and state security cases, treason and libel and so forth. So what the power the executive actually had was to nullify prosecutions either by filing a nolle after the indictment or issuing a pardon after the conviction. Most of the actual prosecutions were undertaken privately by a citizen who went to the grand jury. Such investigation as there was done by a justice of the peace, an institutional creature who is a monster from the standpoint of a separation of functions. So the question is, if people were, and this is a system they were familiar with and comfortable with, what does that tell us about the content of the executive power which was to be operated by the unified executive?
A specific historical question that was alluded to, I think, by Jack, and I wonder what your thought is. On June 1st, after Wilson makes his motion for a single executive, the very first reactions are, wow, that will include the powers of war and peace. And then, things go on a little bit, and then Wilson is the one who dissents from that. And he says the only strictly executive powers are to execute the law and I think to appoint officers. And my historical question is this, that vision seems to correspond to Locke's idea of executive power and federative power being two different things. And I wondered, do you think that's a plausible interpretation of what Wilson said, and is there some reason to think that Wilson might have gotten his ideas then from Locke rather than just from the Scots?
So I don't mean to suggest that he didn't read Locke. I mean, he clearly did. One of the most fascinating things that the modern historians are doing right now is they are actually going back to the libraries in Scotland where he studied and getting the borrowing records where they can, to the extent they exist. I mean, a great deal of them have been lost, and literally seeing what he wrote. And one of the small breakthroughs that's happened in the literature is they didn't realize that he actually spent a brief time at St. Andrews. And they've now gone to those libraries and seeing what he read. And so it's fairly clear. I don't mean to suggest that he didn't read Montesquieu or Locke. He did. But when you look at the block, it's what he read in addition to Montesquieu and Locke that other people tended not to be reading or not to be as influenced by that is so interesting about his jurisprudence and the way it develops. And so it's a really fascinating development when you look at it that he was animated by a humanist perspective that is quite modern and weathers very, very well. That isn't always present in all of the framers. And so I do think that there is, so what would be a better thing I would look for is the smoking gun. He never directly refers to Locke. And to the extent to which he talks about any of the major theorists of executive power, he is extremely, in his law lectures of 1792, critical of Blackstone. And in fact, distances himself on a whole bunch of things and is not afraid to do that. And I don't mean to suggest the fact that he doesn't cite them, that he wasn't perhaps influenced by them. What he does say clearly is the executive powers in the federal government should not be defined by what the king's powers were. And that the king's executive powers are an inappropriate model, not the least of which is to combine judicial with executive and all these other huge problems. So he said, we know more from that statement of what he thinks it is not than what it is. And that, in fact, what we are left with is, and, I was talking about this with Mike the other day, is, Mike in the size paper looks at all the Locke and the Blackstone and the Montesquieu and says, they read them, this can't be an accident. They don't have the smoking gun. Clearly, this is the idea of a separation of powers is not an idea, but was present to everyone and was an important animating principle. But they were working very hard, instead of sticking through categories and working through what the nature of the power is, towards an open rebalancing of the power. Now, the other thing I would say is, in response to Mike, is though two things. One is, if you read through the literature, especially going back into the into the state constitutions that preceded the convention, is legislative supremacy really was the alternative for that period from 76 to 87. And it was the default assumption, and that, in fact, the idea that for the first half of that period that you would do anything else was kind of crazy. I mean, it was assumed that you would do that. Now, there's weird things where they do that a little bit, but the discourse tends to favor that. And what I see in sort of Madison and some of these other places, and frankly in Wilson himself and his dislike for the Pennsylvania Constitution, is in a sense that we had needed other institutions to counterweight them in ways that are more politically dynamic, counterweight them in ways, but does so in a way that I think is more dynamic than definitional about what is essentially a legislative, executive, or judicial. In answer to Mike's, your other question, am I endorsing functionalism? No. What I would say is the framers did an active exercise in pragmatic political science, but it's a constitution they were writing. And having made those trade-offs, it is not open for subsequent legislatures to rebalance them as they saw fit to modern. They have Article 5. I mean, we have other articles, the amendment process, the different processes to make this happen. So it is actually possible to think that the framers took a less nominal, more pragmatic vision towards allocating power, and still come to the idea that it is a formal balance of power that's not open for reconstruction once they've created the compromises that they did. In response to Don's, I hadn't really thought about this, but I play around. So the federal executive was extremely weak. Throughout this, it was mostly a handful of tariff and mostly post offices. For the first, and that was the vision. How this plays out, I remember I have to go back and look at the literature. There's also about key time actions and the ability. There's certain things that was going in there, but that's clearly something I need to think more about.
Okay, John Harrison, David Upham, and Earl Maltz.
Presents Wilson as very much a theorist, an ideologue, but the Federal Convention is all about creditors and slave importing states and slave exporting states and this interest and that interest, and people looking out for their personal ambitions, like Alexander Hamilton wanting to make sure that people who weren't born in the United States nevertheless they can become president. And a couple of years later, James Wilson is on the Supreme Court and votes in a way in Chisholm against Georgia that favors his own personal pecuniary interest. So is there a personal ambition, personal interest, some group that Wilson saw himself as a representative for? Or is it just parvenu technocrats will be able to be powerful in the kind of government he is trying to design? Is there any sort of personal interest, material interest going on in Wilson's thinking about why be a Democrat, any of these big questions?
Just a couple points, both agreeing with some of the criticisms, but also disagreeing with them. You say that I think you do care. You kind of put you exaggerate the degree to which Madison is not a Republican or a populist, in particular by using terms like he wanted to frustrate democratic will. The language I think Madison more frequently used was popular passion versus reason, which is a somewhat different category. And I'm wondering, and you speak about the mixed regime. Madison speaks fairly frequently about this being a wholly popular government. At least he says it is. That this is not we're going to take a popular element and throw in an aristocratic. The only way it's a mixed regime maybe is being partly federal, partly national, but that's a different type of mixture than a popular, aristocratic, and monarchical element. On the other hand, you mentioned some things about the lectures in law. I just wanted to say, in terms of
showing Wilson to be more of a populist. There's more of that in the lectures in law in terms of his theories. And also there's there's this one speech that I looked at recently, July 4th, 1788 speech on the ratification of the Constitution. And he's got this soaring rhetoric that I don't think Madison would ever have said. It says here that a people free and enlightened establishing a system of government which they have previously considered, examined, and approved. This spectacle is the most dignified one that has ever yet appeared on our globe. I mean, this is like the awesomest moment ever in history. I don't see Madison or Hamilton saying that, but Wilson has something like that. And part of it also is because his conception of...
Just like Federalist 38.
Does he say that?
Historically, they're pretty such an extraordinary.
But also the degree to which Wilson in the lectures on law thinks human beings can know and implement the right, either by natural reason or moral sense. I mean, I think you alluded to it. It wasn't in the paper yet. Yeah.
On this question of who wanted to limit the legislature's power in selecting the president, we have also evidence that it's not particularly Wilson Wilson wants popular elections, I understand that, but that we have the evidence of what happens after the committee reports the original electoral college things, and it's Madison in the southern states who are trying to limit the times, limit the options of the legislature in the event that the electoral college cannot select and nobody gets a majority in the electoral college. I believe the original number is 5, and it's Madison who wants to get it to 3 or 2 or whatever. So it's not, I mean, that I just don't see that as saying that, that's just not what, I don't see that as being what Wilson's about at all. Wilson is about specifically direct election of presidents, he loses, and with respect to everyone else, they're trying to, and Pinckney's about the legislature and he loses, and everyone else is sort of trying to reach a workable compromise. I will say that 3 times fast, but the point is, I just don't see this as having the electoral college as a Wilsonian thing at all, or limiting the power rather than the legislature as being a Wilson thing at all. And I have to say I apologize because I can't remember who originally proposed an electoral college early in the convention, and that just shows that I'm getting old and it's getting, 4th or 5th paper.
It was Wilson.
It was Wilson?
It was Wilson.
Okay.
And he proposes immediately after he loses the vote on direct presidential elections.
Was it direct election of the electoral college, though? Is that what it? I think it was direct election of electors. Am I not? No?
He won
Okay,
the
then I'm
direct
wrong.
election of the presidency and then lost that. He did propose the electoral college.
Okay,
as
then
a
I'm wrong.
fallback position. And so, it's one of these things where, how that plays out. And the thing you're talking about is what happens if the electoral college fails. And in fact, that was a huge issue. And people thought back then they thought that the House of Representatives would routinely be involved in selecting the president because they thought that this kind of deadlock would be fairly common. They didn't envision sort of the party systems and how these things would come out. And so I actually think that it's not necessarily, I don't see the conflict that you do between those two positions necessarily, in the sense that I could see having different opinions about how you solve the deadlock and still favoring this vector in Wilson towards more and more direct elections. And in that sense, the compromise isn't direct, but it's still, the electoral college proposal he makes does prevail. Notwithstanding the really weird one that Sam points out that none of us can figure out about, a bad day for anyone. John, in answer to your specific question, he did have an interest to promote, his own. The historians have done the analysis for when he was in the Continental Congress, which they say was a really bad role for an intellectual because it was pure politics. He shamelessly promoted his own interests the entire time. He's no angel. He speculator in land. He owned land larger than some states, took every penny he had, plowed it back into land. People say that his favoring a national bank is because he wanted more credit and more land. And so to answer your question, is he representing an interest? Yeah, the old-fashioned one, his own. And so it's interesting that he does have the soaring rhetoric in these visions, but he did not hesitate to take care of himself when he had the opportunity to do so. The thing I'm struck about whether, about David, your comment, passion versus reason. Reason, someone said the word, I think Earl talked about technocrats. reason, what is this opponent, this countervailing force, and what gives it content? And is it the idea of cooler heads prevailing in just the notion of faction and this, mob rule or whatever you think about it? But there's a strong suggestion of sort of right answerism in it. That is, it's not so much passions versus non-passions, it's passions versus reason, and some idea that there's some platonic place out there. And assuming that, maybe, as I sit here and think about it, are we talking about something we're going to derive directly, or are we going to institutionally find some proxy that's supposed to do that? That is some class or some group structurally that's more likely to do that, or a deliberative body that's constructed in a way that's more likely to reach that? That's an interesting question to me, because if there's certain interpretations of that seem pro-democratic, and there's some that seem less. That is, one is you try to slow things down and make sure that people come to decisions that they would. There's other things that are saying that democracy doesn't come to the right decisions, and I'm going to play around with the literature and see if I can dig and find more, but that reason worries me. It rings off all kinds of weird alarm bells in my head.
We have Zach Price, and then there is room on the queue for questions after me. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, did you? I thought you caught my. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, Zach Price.
You can put me after.
Yeah.
I just sort of a big picture question, which is how should we think about Wilson as an authority? And it's drawing off. I mean, it seems to me his focus on accountability, particularly in the lectures on law, and when he talks about appointments and offices, is very intuitive from a modern perspective and helps very useful as an organizing principle, but also, as you point out, seems somewhat idiosyncratic within its time. So does that mean that if we're using Wilson, we're kind of looking back in the past and finding a friend? Or do you mean to suggest that his underappreciated role in the convention itself means that maybe his views should count for more than they might otherwise?
I wasn't sure if there was a group of three or a group of two, but so I have a big picture point and a couple of very small ones. The big picture one, I think it builds on some of the other remarks, which is that I think there's a tension in the paper between the image of James Wilson as visionary who saw things that the other founders largely ignored or didn't understand and therefore was ahead of his time, and the picture of Wilson as the dominant father of the Constitution more so than Madison, which you paint, which I think is at odds. If his views were very different from those of the others, it's hard to see how he could have gotten his views instantiated. It may well be, as some people have suggested, that the portrait of Wilson as visionary who is vindicated by history is more supported by the evidence, the portrait of him as the father of the Constitution. But if you're going to go that route, and I'm not sure whether you should or not, but if you're going to go that route, you want to flesh this out. For instance, I don't think it's enough to say, well, Wilson's vision was vindicated and we can see all around us, his work is there. There are many things that have happened over the 200 years or more since Wilson that might support his positions but might not. Take one small, or actually one big example in terms of Wilson's democratic vision. How does that relate to the fact that we have a vast federal bureaucracy which is not elected, and which there's a debate today about how much public opinion actually constrains that bureaucracy or not, and in what ways. So you want to flesh out this visionary image more if that's the direction you want to go on. Small comments, one on the Scottish Enlightenment. I think obviously many of the other founders were influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment as well, so Madison, Jefferson, and others. You want to say it's not enough to say if Wilson was different, that he was influenced by the Scots and they were not. Another more specific point in the Scottish Enlightenment, you may want to look to Alison McCroy's book, The Ideological Origin of American Federalism, where she argues, I think with some force, that many American views on the need to limit federal power were based on Scottish Enlightenment views, where the Scots worried after the Act of Union of 1707 that Scotland would be overborne by England, so there need to be limits on the powers of Parliament and the like to prevent that. Finally, on Madison and democracy, Madison actually wrote a good deal about political knowledge and ignorance. Like I discussed some of it in my book on political ignorance, which came out in the fall. Overall, Madison was a political knowledge pessimist. That is, he thought the public was largely ignorant and that they needed to be constrained. He said this at various points. He even wrote in a letter that at the time of the ratification debate in Virginia, he thought most of the voters in Virginia didn't actually understand what the Constitution was about and what the issues were. He did, however, later in life suggest maybe we can increase political knowledge through education. That's not as much of a theme in his thought as in Jefferson, so you might want to take a look at some of that. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that this fully represented all the thoughts of the other founders, but they were probably closer to him on that than they were to Jefferson, who was more optimistic about the public's ability over time to come to understand stuff. I don't know how much of that you want to put in or not. So I think very interesting, clearly a lot of interesting stuff about Wilson I didn't know before, but you maybe want to figure out sort of how best to flesh that out and what's the picture you want to paint, the visionary or the father of the Constitution.
I was just going to add my own question, which is if you could explain what sort of vision of democracy Wilson had that he felt it was a good idea to have the Supreme Court involved in override of presidential vetoes.
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, he clearly felt that the president needed the additional support of the courts to resist the legislature. And the interesting question you put to me is, if he was such a Democrat, why would he fear the legislature? And in fact, one of the consistent thread that comes up is he has a greater faith in elections as a curative and less need for institutional structures. But that's a case where he clearly felt some degree of institutional engineering was required. And I don't have a clear answer to that. It is a nice question. I have to think about that. So what do we do with Wilson's views? Well, the consistent theme I'm getting here is there's two, and it does from the speed I'm doing it, I'm sort of, you have to understand the weird thing, like many of you understand, this paper's been kicking around for a long time. And it's one of these things, this thing finally got me to write it, because I promised, I do this to myself, I'm, Odysseus tying myself to the mast. And sometimes you get things that happen too quickly. There are two thoughts. One is, did Wilson get enough credit for the convention? Maybe not. I'm sitting here thinking, Ferrand says he's number 2, Rossiter says he's number 2. How much more credit do you want? So maybe this, this story isn't hold up. There's some really nice work I was just talking about with John during the break. For example, what's been fascinating is his biggest contribution, probably more than any other, was in the Committee on Detail. And that has been a remarkably understudied chapter of the event. And so, in fact, what happened was there's a colleague of mine named Bill Ewald who actually has gone back to the original documents instead of going back to Ferrand. And actually, all these notations, which don't make a hell of a lot of sense in Ferrand because they're just not there, he's actually starting to puzzle them through and actually trying to figure out how this works. And the beautiful thing about the article that's in Constitutional Commentary, I think last year, where he says, most histories of the convention, they deal with the Committee on Detail like a paragraph, maybe a couple pages, instead of looking at the legacy of the drafts and whether Randolph or Rutledge made corrections to Wilson. And in fact, there's some really interesting history that could really be mined that way that's quite interesting. I guess, when I sit here and hear the reactions, I do think that my overwhelming sense is that his vision has aged exceptionally well. And in response to Ilya, it's not like everything between, he reminds me, and particularly with his statements about executive power, which is how I got into this, he reminds me of Jackson. I don't need to go all the way to the present day. But this vision, what we normally associate with Jackson, of the president being a man of the people and representing a broad polity, seems to have its roots as early, certainly as the 1792 lectures, but seems to have its roots back in Wilson, that he was articulating that vision as clearly as that. Now, does that mean, what should we make of this, that one founder says all this? Like, with all these things, this is enormously problematic. And in fact, our obsession with the Federalist Papers, just because they're so accessible and so eloquent, what's interesting to me is some things I've seen in the historical literature that suggest that the statement, whether I credit it or not, but out of the historical literature, that his pamphlet was actually more widely read than the Federalist Papers. And that, in fact, we have this tendency to assume, there's a wonderful thing that we assume that Madison's notes were the convention. Well, they're not. They're selective, and there's all these problems, there's omissions, there are inconsistencies with the other things, and in fact, we have a tendency to take certain things and blow them up, and I think there's a lot to be said about taking a holistic view of this. Even if you put Wilson number 2, I do think that the ways he's contributed to the convention in many ways do get understudied. There's only been in his whole life 2 full biographies written of Wilson, which is unusual, and there's these other things. But I guess the overwhelming sense I do have is that he was ahead of his time, and that many of the ideas that he introduced, even if they lose, ended up actually becoming much more closer to the system we have today than many realize.